Hello, good evening, and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana, 104.5 FM and UPTV. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU, UCIMC, or, as we like to say on this show, UPTV. These views are our own, and by our in this instance, I mean myself, and or anyone whose views that I happen to be reading. So, good evening and welcome. As I said, it's been a little while since there was an update on the live radio show. Those of you who catch this through UPTV or our YouTube channel, there's been no interruption, but the radio has been kind of inconsistent lately. There's been some problems getting shows there. I apologize if you've tuned in and you heard the same thing week after week, but we're still doing these remotely, and that creates a chain of custody problem, if I can put it that way, a delivery problem that is not always easy to resolve. So sometimes things just don't get delivered, and or they're not received, or they're not processed, or whatever, and they don't get on the air. So please bear with us. It's always a work in progress. Anyway, I thought I would start this program out with a quote. I don't usually do that. This is from the Radical Philosophy Association, entitled Counting All Political Prisoners. And the quote is, "When we think of political prisoner, we usually have in mind someone imprisoned either for their political beliefs or their anti-government activity. In the United States today, very few people are recognized as being political prisoners, although there are some. In reality, there are tens of thousands who should be recognized as such, not because of their political beliefs or actions. Continued incarceration is due to being exploited for political gain by politicians, prosecutors, and judges." And I thought this was particularly appropriate, given that we're approaching election season, for one thing. Well, we're approaching election day, actually. And the whole notion of how we treat immigrants and how we think about immigrants becomes, it's a big point. It becomes like a focal point of how we view the two competing parties and their beliefs about what an American should be, who an American is, who has the right to call themselves that, all those different kinds of things. And so it's an interesting time to realize, to sort of step back and realize that a lot of the people that are locked up, a lot of the immigrants in ICE custody and all these things, they're locked up not because they're dangerous, not because there's anything about them other than their citizenship status or their paperwork trail, or however you want to look at it, that makes them a danger to others. They're there simply because it is politically expedient for the party currently in power to portray them as a danger, and therefore something that we need to be defended against. And that's why they're locked up. So they are, in fact, political prisoners. And we are responsible for that. And we should be responsible with our vote to do something about that. Anyway, interestingly, though, on this topic, first article, entitled "Immigration, Trump's Signature Issue Takes a Back Seat in 2020 Campaign." The urgency of the pandemic, the president's vulnerability on immigration, and his decision to focus on messaging around law and order have pushed the issue into the background. When President Donald Trump announced his intention to run for president in 2016, he pledged to build a wall on the southern border that Mexico would pay for. He ran on that promise, positioning it so effectively at the center of his campaign that chants of "build the wall" quickly became familiar refrains at his rallies. In 2018, before the midterm elections in which Democrats ultimately took back control of the House, Trump drummed up fears about a caravan of migrants walking through Mexico towards what he characterized as an eventual invasion of the U.S. And as president, his administration has taken more than 400 executive actions that have dismantled and dramatically reshaped the current immigration system. Yet, immigration has been little more than a footnote this campaign season. Despite being Trump's signature issue as both a candidate and a president, immigration has faded from the discourse surrounding the election, pushed aside by more prominent messaging from both Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden on the coronavirus, the economy, and recent racial justice protests. The issue has also slipped in voters' priorities. It has not come up often even in moderated settings. Immigration was not discussed in any depth at the first presidential debate, the vice presidential debate, or Trump and Biden's dueling town halls last week, aside from a passing mention and a single question from an audience member. Some, but not all, of the explanation, analysts say, is simply that current events are so pressing that they have consumed both campaigns. There's a point at which real-world events intrude upon the campaign in a way that can no longer be ignored, says Jacob Nees-Heisel, an associate professor of political science at the University at Buffalo, who studies political communication and elections. And while I'm certain that Donald Trump would love to be talking about immigration, I think that's probably a pivot too far. The world just isn't letting him set the agenda in this case. The sidelining of immigration this election cycle is particularly notable considering the laser-like focus with which Trump has treated the issue during his presidency, guided by senior advisor Stephen Miller, an immigration restrictionist. In 2019, migration at the southern border reached levels not seen in over a decade. Trump's administration has made changes, both headline-grabbing and small and technical, at a breakneck pace that have transformed the U.S. immigration system. Trump has severely restricted asylum, altered border policies, built hundreds of miles of wall on the southern border, I don't know about that, slashed refugee admissions, made it harder for immigrants to obtain green cards, and otherwise targeted legal immigration. The administration made those changes while Trump relentlessly spewed a stream of rhetoric targeting illegal immigration and depicting many immigrants as criminals and threats to American workers. Some of Trump's actions have made him vulnerable on immigration policy in a way that he wasn't in 2016, a fact that some analysts posit may be one of the reasons his campaign isn't focusing on the issue. Several of Trump's most prominent immigration actions, like the implementation of border policies that separated migrant children from their parents, and the administration's effort to end the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, are broadly unpopular with voters. Public sentiment has also shifted in the last several years, with more people than ever seeing immigration as a positive phenomenon. Opinion on both immigration in general and Trump's most well-known actions suggests that his rhetoric on the issue plays well only with his base, and analysts agree that Trump will need the votes of Americans outside of that faction to win the presidency again. Still, Trump has not shrunk entirely from talking about immigration. At rallies, he has touted his border record, demonized immigrants and refugees, and highlighted progress on the wall. The Department of Homeland Security has tried to heighten the visibility of its immigration actions in recent weeks, holding press conferences for relatively mundane arrest operations and erecting billboards with the faces of immigrants wanted by Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the swing state of Pennsylvania. Remember what I said earlier about political prisoners. Something officials insist has nothing to do with the election. But the issue remains at the periphery, not the center of Trump's campaign. Out of 10 major topics, Immigration is the least mentioned issue in Trump campaign TV ads, according to Kantar CMAG analysis for the Wall Street Journal. Biden, on the other hand, has similarly not made Trump's immigration record central. He has instead more frequently slammed the White House response to the coronavirus pandemic, which has killed more than 222,000 Americans and counting, and focused on health care. It was easy for Biden to do that because all of our lives are governed by COVID-19. They're all shaken up because of it. So they know it's a message that's going to resonate with people, says David Barker, a professor of government at American University. Biden has also attempted to distance himself from the controversial immigration actions taken by the Obama administration when he was a vice president, actions that alternately angered immigration advocates and Republicans. Deportations from the interior of the country spiked under President Barack Obama, and his administration instituted accelerated, so-called rocket docket court proceedings that sparked concerns about due process. Republicans decried the creation of the DACA program by DHS as an extra-legal overreach of executive authority. Still, Barker says he's surprised Biden and the Democrats in general haven't harped on Trump's divisive immigration record more. But my guess is that while he benefits from talking about those things, he benefits more from talking about COVID, Barker says of the former vice president. If the U.S. were not in the middle of dealing with a global pandemic, Neuheisel says he would expect Biden to be attacking Trump on immigration more fervently. If this were normal politics, I'm sure we would see that. You've seen oblique references to policy failures, but not that one. And I think it's largely because people aren't really interested right now. Polling shows immigration has taken a back seat in voters' minds to concerns related to the pandemic and the economy. In a Pew Research Center survey conducted in the late summer, some 52% of Americans said immigration was very important to their vote, ninth on a list of issues topped by the economy, health care, the Supreme Court, and the coronavirus outbreak. In a similar survey taken ahead of the 2016 election, 70% of voters said immigration was very important, making it the sixth most important issue ahead of Supreme Court appointments, race relations, the environment, and abortion. The issue has slipped among the Latino voting bloc, usurped by concerns related to the coronavirus. Trump has tried to court Latino voters, particularly in the swing state of Florida. Nearly two-thirds of Latino voters say they'll vote for Biden, according to a recent Pew survey. A similar share voted for Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. Immigration was fifth on a list of Latino voters' top issue priorities, according to a poll conducted in August by Unidos US and Somos US. The coronavirus topped voters' priorities, followed by the economy, health care, and racial discrimination. In contrast, immigration has been among the top three most important issues for Latino voters in the last decade, and in some years was the number one issue, according to analysis from Unidos US, a nonprofit Latino advocacy and research organization. Not surprisingly, given the disproportionate impact of COVID on the Latino community, COVID response is dominating the list of priorities for Latino voters, says Clarissa Martinez del Castro, Deputy Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at Unidos US, who noted that immigration remains one of the top 5 priorities. Martinez de Castro says Latinos would still like to hear the campaign discuss immigration more robustly. If you had a functioning, robust immigration system that was working properly, some of the things that are tripping people up or that are leaving families out of relief and support would not be an issue, whether we're talking about addressing the pandemic from a health perspective or from an economic perspective, she says. Experts also note that Trump has shifted from drilling down on animus for immigrants, like he did in 2016, to now denouncing racial justice protesters, pledging law and order, and warning suburbanites that low-income housing would invade their neighborhood, the same language he has used about migrants. Public safety is the most mentioned topic in Trump campaign TV ads, according to the analysis prepared for the Wall Street Journal. The umbrella category includes messaging on law and order, suggestions that crime would spike under Biden, ominous footage from protests, and accusations that the radical left is seeking to defund police departments. The implicit message is the same, which is, hey, suburban white women, we know that you're suburban white women swing voters, and so I believe you are afraid of black and brown people. And because I believe that you are afraid of black and brown people, I'm going to gin up those fears by talking about Mexican rapists running across the border in 2016 or crazy looting in the street and whatnot going on in 2020, Parker says. The specific issue may be slightly different, but the underlying message is the same. Beyond Trump's publicly unpopular child separation policy and polling that shows that a majority of voters oppose the border wall and attempts to dismantle the program that protects immigrants brought to this country illegally as children, public support for immigration as a whole has increased in the last several years despite rhetoric from the White House. About a third of Americans support increasing immigration, the highest percentage on record since 1965, according to ongoing polling from Gallup. Support for decreasing immigration is at a record low. Gallup also found that 77% of Americans say immigration is good for the country, the highest level of support since Gallup started polling on the issue in 2001. Another survey from Pew found 62% of Americans believe immigrants strengthen the U.S. because of their hard work and talents, compared to just 28% who believe they are a burden to the country. Each survey, however, revealed a stark partisan divide, with Democrats far more supportive of immigration than Republicans. The Trump campaign's decision not to center immigration may in some ways be beneficial for him. There's evidence that Trump's focus on immigration as both a candidate and campaigner, and the subsequent focus on immigration by down-ballot Republican candidates has done little to help Republicans in southwestern states where immigration is often top of mind and could even have hurt. An analysis of the 2018 midterms by Republican strategist David Winston found that immigration and the caravan were the issues voters heard most about from Republican candidates in the lead-up to the election, and 59% were less favorable toward GOP candidates after hearing messaging about immigration, though Republican voters were largely receptive. It had a particular consequence for Republicans with late deciding voters. The closing focus in the final days of the campaign was on the immigration caravan message, popular with the base and those at President Trump's rallies, but also controversial and divisive, particularly with independents. The people who made their decision over the last few days voted Democratic by a 12-point margin, Winston wrote in the analysis. Overall, Democrats flipped 12 House seats in the Southwest in 2018, 7 of which were in California. 2 of those flipped House seats were in Texas, and in the presidential election in 2016, support for Trump in 2016 was 5 percentage points below support for Republican Mitt Romney in 2012. Current polling shows Trump just slightly ahead of Biden in the state, which has been a Republican stronghold for decades. Arizona, in 2018, elected its first Democratic senator since 1988. Polling shows Biden barely ahead of Trump, and the state is considered a toss-up. Arizona hasn't voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1996. In 2016, support for the Republican presidential candidate similarly slipped 5 percentage points. Republican support also eroded in New Mexico, Colorado, and California in 2016, though New Mexico and Colorado also saw support for the Democrat candidate dip. Simon Rosenberg, a Democratic strategist and the president of the Liberal Democrat New Network, of the Liberal New Democrat Network and the New Policy Institute, says he thinks Trump's previous focus on immigration has made his 2020 race more difficult. While immigration may not be a top issue in the current debate, it has played a major role in the election. Trump's extremism on the issue has helped push the heavily Mexican-American parts of the country even further away from the president and his party, making his electoral college map far harder, and the Senate far more likely to flip, Rosenberg says. Frank Sherry, the executive director of America's Voice, an immigrant political advocacy organization, says he believes Trump's hardline stance on immigration and his rhetoric on the issue have forced the American public to define their opinions in relation to the president's actions, something that has backfired for the president. Immigration has lost its salience, especially with voters in the middle, and Trump's extremism has forced Americans to choose whether they embrace his radicalism or reject it. And the most remarkable thing over the last 4 years is that a solid majority reject it, Jerry said. Public opinion has solidified in more progressive circles and moved decisively in a pro-immigrant direction in the middle, leaving Trump locked in the cul-de-sac of his base, he said. So that's kind of interesting. I like that they sort of dug into this a bit and really looked at not only what's happening, but some reasons why it might be happening. Sorry, my chair is very squeaky. Because it's easy enough to just, I don't know, follow the politics of the moment. I think we all are victims of this to a certain extent, where whatever's in the news is like in our face, and we feel forced to react to it. It's like, oh, there's a hurricane in Botswana, or whatever the thing is that comes up, and you're like, well, gosh, Botswana is a major producer of blah blah. Everyone starts to think about topics related to this news because it is pushed to the front and treated as if this is the important thing that's going on right now. Here's what you need to be thinking / worrying about. And it's easy to just go with that flow, I think, and forget about things that are actually important to you, or that are just actually important generally, that for some reason are just not being treated as important, if that makes sense, as important, not being treated as importantly. I don't know how grammatically you're supposed to say that, but anyway, they aren't being treated with the same level of interest as this other new thing. But that doesn't mean they've gone away, and it doesn't mean that they are no longer of interest or import. And so I feel like, to a certain extent, immigration has become one of those issues right now where it's still really important. It's important to me and the people that I work with and work on behalf of. But right now we're all going, oh, virus, oh, riots, police shootings. We're having these other things stuck in our face, and then we're having to go, well, what is my opinion about riots? What is my opinion about viruses? What is my, I guess in order to feel politically savvy, politically knowledgeable, aware, we feel that we have to have an opinion about these things. And therefore, in order to have an opinion, you have to maybe do a little research, like, well, what is this thing? And why is it like this? And why are these people saying this about this? And why are these people reacting that way about that? I remember, for example, just a personal thing, when during the run-up to the Iraq War, back in the Bush years, I felt compelled to study the history of the Middle East and to learn how did Iraq become Iraq? What happened in that area? What was going on? Who are these different tribes, the Sunnis and the Shiites, or these different religious sects? And all that. And it was information that I knew vaguely from before that. I had a general understanding of the post-World War II political movements in that area, but I didn't know that much about it. And suddenly, hey, we're going to have a war, and here's our reasons for wanting to have it. And these other people are saying, here's the reasons why we don't think we need to have it. And I recall thinking, it just doesn't sound right. There's something wrong with this whole thing. So down I go the rabbit hole into learning about the history of the leaders and the politics and how these countries came into being, how the area was divided after the war and all that sort of thing. And, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing because while I don't remember a lot of the details that I learned at the time, I do have a greater understanding of that area generally for having spent the time to study it so that I could feel like I had an educated opinion on the topic of what was going on and what was liable to happen and what might happen. So, I think it's a good thing generally that people do it, but I also think it's misleading in that it tends to push us to think that only what is big in the news is what is important. And that other things, if you don't see it in the news, then there's probably nothing going on there. There's probably nothing to worry about or think about or to be concerned. But a lot of what the Trump administration has done in the last 4 years has been kind of quiet. And it's been, the effective things that it's doing are the things that it just kind of sneaks by. And thanks to a lot of hardworking investigative reporters and advocates, we find out about this stuff. And I try to share these activities with you so that you know what's going on. But really, for the most part, a lot of them have taken place under the radar. So for however much that we, the people interested in this topic, are aware of the activities of the current administration regarding immigration and refugees over the last 4 years, I would hazard a guess that the average American does not know much of any of it. They knew about the travel ban. They knew about the kids in cages. These big things that kind of came up and that people started talking about. But a lot of the other stuff, no, they don't know anything about it. So to their mind, not much has happened since the kids in cages thing, for example. That I think was the last big public uproar. And so they're like, well, that was a while ago. Right now, here's what's going on. But in the meantime, since then, a lot of other things have happened. And we ignore them at our peril. And I think it is good, at least if I do nothing else with this show, it's good that I have this opportunity to remind people of that sort of thing and just kind of share some information about it so that people actually realize what's going on, what is being done. And I look forward to continuing to complain. I know that's a weird way of saying it, but I will undoubtedly, I think, to be fair, no matter who wins the election, there's still going to be a lot left to work on as far as immigration goes. We have a long way to go because there are a lot of people who just have really ridiculous and let's face it, racist or xenophobic attitudes towards immigrants, and there's going to be work to be done. So I will be complaining or educating or